The knife was already at Elena's throat when she realized the man holding it did not know she could see every inch of his face. She kept her eyes wide and empty, the way she had trained them for 10 long years, staring somewhere past his shoulder, as if the world beyond her lashes was nothing but fog and shadow. Her hands trembled, but not from fear of the blade. She trembled because she recognized the ring on his finger, a silver wolf head with ruby eyes, the same ring that had once belonged to the man who tried to kill her when she was a child of 7. "You hear well for a blind girl," the man muttered, his breath sour with wine. "Too well." "I hear because I have nothing else," Elena whispered, letting her voice crack in exactly the right place. "Please, I only carry water for the kitchens." He shoved her aside, disgusted, and stalked off down the corridor of the Ashworth Palace, his boots striking the stone floor like a countdown. Elena did not move until the sound faded completely. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, pressing her back against the cold wall, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her ears. 10 years of this, 10 years of walking with her chin tilted slightly upward, her gaze soft and unfocused, her feet finding the edges of tables and door frames, half a second before anyone expected a blind girl to know they were there. 10 years of swallowing every flinch, every flicker of recognition, every moment where her body wanted to react to danger the way a seeing person reacts, quick and sharp and aimed. She was Elena Voss to everyone in the palace of King Ashworth. To herself, in the silence of her small room beneath the servants' stairs, she was still the girl who had watched her own mother die, trying to protect her from a man who wanted the Voss bloodline erased forever. She had been 7 years old. She remembered every second of it, and she remembered that the only reason she survived was because an old healer woman found her in the woods and taught her a secret that had kept her alive ever since. Sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight, wearing a weakness no one thinks to question. Blindness was armor. Nobody suspects the eyes that cannot see. The kitchens of the Ashworth Palace were loud and busy in the late afternoon, the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread thick in the air. Elena moved through the chaos with practiced ease, her wooden bucket swinging gently at her side, her steps measured and slow enough to look uncertain, but never actually stumbling. The other servants had long since stopped watching her closely. That was the point. When people stop watching you, they stop seeing what you truly are. "Elena." A soft voice caught her attention, and she turned toward it with the careful delay of someone locating a sound rather than a face. Mira Fenwick, a young cook with flour dusted across her apron, touched her arm gently to guide her. "The steward wants water sent to the war room. The king is meeting with his commanders." Elena's pulse quickened, though her expression stayed calm. The war room. She had never been asked to serve there before. It was the one place in the palace she had always avoided, because it was the one place where the men who ran the kingdom gathered to speak freely, believing themselves unheard. "Of course," Elena said, keeping her voice light. "Lead me there." Mira guided her down a long hallway, lined with old tapestries, depicting wolves in battle, their woven eyes seeming to follow every step. Elena let her fingers brush lightly against the wall as they walked, feeling the texture change from smooth stone to carved wood, memorizing the path, even though she needed no such help. It was the performance that mattered. Every gesture had to look real, because in the Ashworth court, there were eyes everywhere, and not all of them belonged to humans. The war room doors were heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. A guard opened them without a word, and Elena stepped inside behind Mira, her bucket balanced carefully so the water would not spill and reveal any unnatural steadiness. King Cain Ashworth stood at the head of a long table covered in maps, his broad shoulders squared, his dark hair pushed back from a face that carried the weight of a crown he had worn for only 3 months. He had inherited the throne after his father, King Alden, died suddenly, under circumstances the court still whispered about in careful tones. Cain was younger than most alphas who held such power, but there was nothing uncertain in the way he commanded the room. His voice, low and steady, cut through the murmurs of his advisors like a blade through silk. "The northern border pack will not hold another season without reinforcement," Cain said, tapping a point on the map. "Draven Cole grows bolder every week. If we do not answer him with strength, he will see it as invitation." Elena's entire body went still at the name. Draven Cole, the alpha who wore the silver wolf ring, the man who had held a knife to her throat less than an hour ago, walking freely through the palace, as if he belonged there. She kept pouring water into the cups set before the advisors, her hands moving with careful, deliberate slowness, her face empty of any reaction. Inside, her mind raced. Draven Cole was here, in the Ashworth Palace, sitting at negotiation tables with the very king, who was now discussing how to counter him. It made no sense, unless the alliance between the packs was far more fragile and far more dangerous than anyone had told her. "My king," said an older man with a graying beard. Corwin Blake, the king's most trusted advisor. Cole requested this meeting himself. "He claims he wishes to discuss a truce. Perhaps we should hear him before assuming the worst." "Cole does not request meetings out of goodwill," Kane said flatly. "He requests meetings when he wants something, and he takes what he wants when words fail him." Elena moved to fill the final cup, the one nearest the king himself. As she leaned forward, her sleeve brushed against a folded map on the table, and for half a second, her eyes flicked downward, sharp and clear, taking in the markings before she caught herself, and pulled her gaze back to its practiced emptiness. It was too late. Kane had been watching her. He said nothing in that moment, his expression giving away nothing either, but something in his chest tightened with a question he could not quite name. He had seen 100 blind servants over the years, men and women who had lost their sight to sickness, or age, or misfortune, and every one of them moved with a particular kind of hesitation, a slight searching quality in how they reached for things. Elena's hand had gone to that cup with no hesitation at all. It had gone exactly where it needed to go, as if she had seen precisely where the cup sat on the table. He said nothing, because a king does not accuse a servant girl of lying in front of his war council over something so small, but he filed it away, the way he filed away every small detail that did not fit the shape of the world as everyone insisted it should be. "Thank you," he said instead, his voice quieter than before, almost gentle. "You may go." Elena bowed her head, murmured something soft in reply, and let Mira lead her from the room. Her heart did not slow until the heavy doors closed behind them, and she was back in the corridor, the cool air of the hallway a small relief against the heat rising in her skin. "You look pale," Mira said as they walked. "Did something happen in there?" "No," Elena lied smoothly. "The room was warm, that is all. But something had happened. She had felt it, the weight of the king's attention lingering on her, a beat too long, a stillness in him that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with her. 10 years she had walked these halls without anyone looking closely enough to wonder. She had built her entire survival around the certainty that no one, especially not a king with a kingdom to run and enemies circling at his borders, would spare a second thought for a blind servant girl carrying water. She had not accounted for a king who noticed everything. That night, Elena sat on the edge of her narrow bed, in the small room she shared with 2 other servant girls, both already asleep, their soft breathing filling the quiet dark. She pulled a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard, the only possession she had carried with her since she was 7 years old. Inside it lay a single piece of jewelry, a thin silver bracelet engraved with a rose, the last gift her mother had given her, before the attack that took her life. Elena traced the engraving with her fingertip, though she did not need to look at it to know every curve of the design. She had memorized it the way she memorized everything now, storing details away in the dark corners of her mind where no one could reach them. Draven Cole was in the palace, the man who had killed her mother, who had hunted her through the woods as a child, who still wore the ring that marked him as the last surviving enemy of her bloodline, was sitting at the negotiation table with King Ashworth himself. And the king had looked at her in a way no one had looked at her in 10 years. She closed the box and slid it back beneath the floorboard, her mind turning over the danger from every angle. She could request a transfer to another wing of the palace, somewhere far from the war room and far from the king's watchful eyes. She could ask Mira to take over any tasks that brought her near Draven Cole. She could disappear further into the role she had built, becoming even more careful, even more invisible. Or she could do nothing, and hope that a busy king with a fracturing kingdom had no time to spare for the strange behavior of a servant girl. Elena lay back on her thin mattress and stared up at the dark ceiling, her unblinking eyes, truly seeing nothing now, only shadow and old wooden beams. For 10 years, she had survived by becoming someone else entirely, by burying Elena Voss so deeply beneath the mask of a blind servant that even she sometimes forgot which parts of herself were real anymore. But masks were never permanent. Somewhere in the back of her mind, A quiet voice reminded her that every lie has an ending, and hers had just begun to crack, one careless glance at a folded map at a time. Outside her small window, the moon rose high over the Ashworth Palace, casting long silver light across the courtyard, where guards changed their watch, and wolves howled somewhere in the distant hills. Elena listened to the sound, familiar and strange all at once, a reminder of the world she had once belonged to before fear forced her into hiding. She did not sleep easily that night. Somewhere down the hall, in his private chambers, neither did the king. Kane sat by the window of his room, a cup of untouched wine cooling on the table beside him, his mind replaying the moment in the war room, again and again. He thought of the girl's hand moving with certainty toward the cup, no hesitation, no searching. He thought of her eyes, wide and dark and strangely alert despite their supposed emptiness. He did not know why a blind servant girl occupied his thoughts on a night when he should have been planning strategy against Draven Cole and the northern threat gathering at his borders. But something about her felt like a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture everyone else accepted without question. And Kane Ashworth had never been a man who could leave a puzzle unsolved. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out over the sleeping palace grounds, the moonlight silvering the rooftops below. Somewhere out there, behind one of those darkened windows, a girl who was supposed to be blind had looked, however briefly, exactly where she needed to look. He intended to find out why. 3 days after the meeting in the war room, Elena found a folded note, tucked beneath the water pitcher she carried each morning, and her stomach dropped before she even touched it. She had learned long ago never to open anything in a hallway where eyes could watch her reaction, so she slipped the note into her sleeve and continued her rounds, delivering water to the eastern wing with the same careful, measured steps she always used. Only when she reached the small linen closet near the servants' stairs did she allow herself a moment alone, unfolding the paper with fingers that did not shake nearly as much as she expected. The handwriting was strong and slanted, clearly a man's hand, clearly someone who had been taught proper letters as a child of privilege. Meet me in the garden at dusk. Come alone. I only wish to ask you a question. There was no name signed at the bottom, but Elena did not need one. She recognized the authority behind those few words, the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed without explanation. King Kane Ashworth wanted to speak with her, and there was no reasonable way for a servant girl to refuse a summons from the king himself. She spent the rest of the day rehearsing every possible version of the conversation in her mind, testing which answers would sound most convincing, which reactions would look most natural for a girl who genuinely could not see. She told herself this was simply another performance, another role to play, nothing different from the 10 years of performances that came before it. But something about the idea of standing alone with Kane Ashworth, without the noise and distraction of a crowded war room, made her chest feel tight in a way she did not want to examine too closely. Dusk fell over the palace gardens in soft shades of orange and violet, the fountains murmuring quietly beneath rows of trimmed hedges and blooming rose bushes. Elena walked the familiar path with her usual measured pace, her chin tilted slightly upward, her eyes carefully unfocused, even though she could see every petal and every shadow with perfect clarity. Kane was already waiting near the fountain, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, his dark cloak stirring gently in the evening breeze. He looked different out here than he had in the war room, less like a king weighed down by borders and battle plans, and more like a man simply standing in a garden at the end of a long day. "Thank you for coming," he said as she approached, his voice low and even. "I did not think a servant refuses the king," Elena replied, keeping her tone light, almost playful, a mask over the wariness coiling tightly in her chest. "No," Kane agreed. "I suppose she does not." He gestured toward a stone bench near the fountain, and Elena settled onto it with practiced grace, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes drifting toward a point somewhere near his shoulder rather than his face, exactly as a blind woman's gaze might wander without purpose. "I wanted to ask you something," Kane said, seating himself on the opposite end of the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. "How long have you served in this palace?" 10 years, my king," Elena answered honestly. There was no danger in that truth. "And in all that time," Kane continued, choosing his words with obvious care, "how did you learn to move so easily through rooms you cannot see? Most who lose their sight take years to learn such confidence. if they ever learn it at all. Elena's heart beat a little faster, but she kept her expression calm, thoughtful, as if considering a simple question, rather than defending a decade of careful deception. I was very young when I lost my sight, she said. Perhaps that is why. A child's mind adapts more easily than an old one. Perhaps, Kane said, though something in his tone told her he was not entirely convinced. Tell me then, how you knew exactly where to place a cup on a table crowded with maps and papers, without a single moment of searching for it. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Elena felt the ripple of it move through her entire body. She had known this moment would come eventually, some version of it, some clever trap disguised as idle curiosity, but she had hoped it would come later, much later, after she had found a way to disappear from his notice entirely. I listened very closely, she said carefully. The sound of a cup being set down tells me where the table's edge lies. I count my steps. I have done this so many years, it no longer feels like counting at all. Kane studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes narrowed slightly in the fading light, searching her face for any crack in the story she offered so smoothly. Elena forced herself to remain still under that gaze, to let her expression stay soft and unguarded, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to run, to do anything, except sit calmly beside the one man in the kingdom, clever enough to see through her. You are a remarkable woman, Elena Voss, Kane said finally, and something in the way he said her name made her breath catch, though she could not have explained why. I have met soldiers who move with less certainty than you do, in a room full of danger. I have had a great deal of practice surviving in rooms full of danger, Elena said quietly, and this time, the truth slipped out before she could stop it, layered so deeply beneath metaphor that she trusted he could not possibly guess its real meaning. Kane tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering behind his eyes. What do you mean by that? Elena caught herself immediately, forcing a soft, self-deprecating laugh. Only that a blind girl in a busy palace learns quickly, my king, or she does not survive very long at all. Sharp corners and careless boots have taught me many lessons. It was a clever answer, vague enough to explain away the slip, and she watched the tension in Kane's shoulders ease slightly, though his eyes remained thoughtful, still turning something over in his mind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the gentle splash of the fountain and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the garden wall. May I ask you something else? Kane said eventually, his voice softer now, less like a king interrogating a servant, and more like a man simply curious about the person in front of him. Do you ever wish you could see the world again, even for a single day? The question struck somewhere deep and unguarded in Elena's chest, a place she had kept locked away for 10 years beneath layers of careful performance. She thought of her mother's face, the last thing she had truly wanted to memorize before the world went dark with fear and running and hiding. She thought of colors she had not allowed herself to admire openly in a decade, sunsets she watched only through careful sidelong glances disguised as nothing at all. Every day, she admitted quietly, and for once, there was no lie hidden inside the answer. Kane's expression shifted, something gentler passing over his features, and for a moment, Elena forgot to keep her gaze soft and unfocused, forgot the careful performance that had protected her for so long. Her eyes met his directly, clear and sharp and entirely too aware, and she saw the flicker of surprise cross his face, before she caught herself, and quickly looked away, her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain he must hear it. Forgive me, she said quickly, standing from the bench, her voice suddenly unsteady. I should return to my duties before I am missed. Elena, Kane said, and though his voice was calm, there was an edge of command beneath it now, the voice of a king who was not accustomed to being dismissed. Wait. She froze, her back to him, every muscle in her body tense with the terrible awareness that she had made a mistake, a small but potentially fatal mistake, the kind of slip that 10 years of careful discipline had never once allowed her to make until tonight. Yes, my king, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, though her mind raced through every possible explanation she might offer, if he had truly seen what she feared he had seen. Kane rose from the bench and stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence at her back, close enough that the scent of him, cedar and something wilder beneath it, filled the small space between them. Your eyes, he said quietly. Just now, they found mine perfectly. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, forcing her expression into practiced confusion, her eyes deliberately unfocused once more, drifting past his shoulder toward the darkening sky. "I do not understand, my king. I cannot see your eyes at all." For a long, tense moment, Cain simply looked at her, his jaw tight, his golden gaze searching her face for something he could not quite name. Elena held perfectly still, refusing to let even the smallest tremor betray the fear pounding through her veins. "Perhaps I am mistaken," Cain said finally, though his tone suggested he believed no such thing. "It has been a long day. My eyes play tricks in poor light." "As does mine, my king, though I suppose in my case it happens rather more often," Elena said, and the small joke seemed to ease something in the tension between them, drawing a faint, reluctant smile from Cain's otherwise serious mouth. "You may return to your duties," he said quietly. "Thank you for indulging my questions." Elena bowed her head and walked away, her steps measured and careful, her heart hammering wildly beneath her calm exterior. She did not look back, though she could feel his eyes following her the entire length of the garden path, watching, wondering, refusing to let go of the small crack he had glimpsed in her armor. That night, alone in her narrow bed, Elena stared up at the dark ceiling and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of her fear. Cain Ashworth was no fool. He had noticed something true beneath her practiced lies, and men who noticed such things did not simply forget them and move on. Sooner or later he would look again, closer this time, and she was no longer certain her mask would hold against a king determined enough to see through it. Somewhere down the corridor, in his own quiet chambers, Cain stood by his window once more, staring out at the same silver moonlight that had accompanied his thoughts 3 nights before. He could not explain the certainty settling in his chest, the quiet, stubborn conviction that Elena Voss was not at all what she appeared to be. He did not yet know why the thought unsettled him so deeply, nor why some small, unspoken part of him hoped, rather than feared, that he was right. The great hall of the Ashworth Palace had been transformed for the treaty summit, long banners of silver and blue hanging from the rafters, tables arranged in careful rows for the visiting delegations from 3 northern packs. Elena had been assigned to serve the head table that evening, a decision made by the steward without any knowledge of the danger it placed her in, and by the time she learned the guest list, it was already too late to request a change without raising suspicion. Draven Cole sat near the center of the head table, dressed in fine dark clothing that did nothing to soften the cruelty etched into the lines of his face. Elena recognized him instantly, though she had not seen him clearly in 10 years, not since the night he stood over her mother's body in the woods outside their old village, his silver ring catching moonlight as he searched the trees for a girl who had vanished into the dark. She moved through her duties with practiced calm, pouring wine, clearing plates, keeping her gaze soft and unfocused, even as every instinct in her body screamed at her to run from the room and never return. She told herself that Draven Cole would never recognize her. She had been a small, frightened child the last time he saw her, and she was a grown woman now, her face changed by years and hardship, hidden further behind the careful mask of blindness that had protected her for so long. But fate, it seemed, had little interest in her careful calculations. "You," Draven said suddenly, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation at the table, directed straight at Elena as she reached to refill his cup. "Come closer, girl." Elena's hands went still for the briefest moment before she resumed her movement, tilting her head toward the sound of his voice, with the same careful delay she used with every stranger. "Yes, my lord?" "There is something familiar about you," Draven said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Have we met before?" "I do not believe so, my lord," Elena said smoothly, her voice steady, despite the panic clawing at the inside of her chest. "I have served in this palace many years. Perhaps you have simply seen me before, at another gathering." Draven reached out suddenly and caught her wrist, his grip tight and cold, forcing her to stand still beside him as he peered closer at her face. Elena kept her eyes carefully unfocused, staring past him toward nothing, her breathing controlled, even as her pulse hammered wildly beneath his fingers. "Blind, are you?" Draven said slowly, releasing her wrist with something like disappointment. "A pity. I thought perhaps I recognized something in your eyes." "Many people say my eyes look like someone they once knew," Elena said, forcing a small, humble smile onto her lips. "I am told it happens often with those who cannot see, Perhaps our faces seem more alike, without expression to set them apart. Draven grunted, seemingly satisfied by the explanation, and waved her away with a dismissive flick of his hand. Elena bowed and retreated quickly, her legs trembling beneath her long skirts, though she forced herself to keep her pace slow and measured until she reached the safety of the kitchen doorway. From across the hall, seated at the head of the table beside his advisors, Cain Ashworth had watched the entire exchange with a growing sense of unease. He had seen the flash of tension in Elena's shoulders, the way her hand had gone rigid before smoothing itself into practiced calm. And he had seen something else too, something he could not quite name, a flicker of recognition that passed between Draven Cole and the servant girl before both of them buried it beneath careful words. "You seem distracted, my king," Corwin Blake murmured beside him, following his gaze toward the retreating servant. "Is something troubling you?" "Perhaps," Cain said quietly, not taking his eyes from the kitchen doorway where Elena had disappeared. "Tell me, Corwin, what do you know of Draven Cole's history? Before he rose to lead the Northern Pack?" Corwin frowned thoughtfully, stroking his graying beard. "Little more than rumor, my king. There are old stories that Cole eliminated several rival bloodlines during his rise to power, families who might have challenged his claim to leadership. Nothing has ever been proven. The Northern Packs guard their history closely." "Find out more," Cain said, his voice low and firm. "Quietly. I want to know everything about the families he destroyed." Corwin nodded, though his expression carried a note of confusion at the sudden request. "May I ask why, my king?" Cain's gaze drifted once more toward the kitchen doorway, his jaw tight with a suspicion he was not yet ready to speak aloud. "Call it instinct," he said simply. "I have learned to trust it." Later that night, long after the summit feast had ended and the visiting delegations had retired to their guest chambers, Elena sat alone in the small linen closet near the servants' stairs, her hands still trembling from the encounter with Draven Cole. She pressed her palms flat against her knees, forcing herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale until the worst of the panic began to fade. She had survived tonight. That was what mattered. Draven Cole had looked directly into her face and seen nothing but a blind servant girl, exactly as she had trained herself to appear for 10 long years. But the encounter had shaken something loose inside her, old memories she usually kept buried beneath layers of discipline and careful control. She remembered the woods outside her village, the smell of smoke and blood, her mother's voice screaming at her to run and never look back. She remembered hiding beneath a fallen log for 3 days, surviving on rainwater and berries, terrified that every sound in the forest belonged to the men still hunting for her. She remembered the old healer woman who found her half-starved and shaking, who took her in without question, and taught her the secret that had kept her alive ever since. Blindness was armor. Nobody suspects the eyes that cannot see. But armor could crack, and tonight it had come dangerously close to shattering entirely. A soft knock at the linen closet door startled her from her thoughts, and Elena quickly composed herself, smoothing her expression back into practiced calm before answering. "Yes?" The door opened, and Mira slipped inside, her face creased with concern. "I saw what happened at the head table," she whispered. "Are you all right? Lord Cole looked as though he meant to frighten you." "I am fine," Elena said, forcing a reassuring smile. "He simply mistook me for someone else. It happens sometimes." Mira studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, though she did not press the matter further. "The king asked about you afterward," she said instead. "He spoke with Advisor Blake for quite some time, both of them glancing toward the kitchens more than once." Elena's stomach tightened at the news. First Draven Cole's suspicious attention, and now Cain Ashworth's continued curiosity, circling closer and closer to the truth she had spent a decade burying. She had known the risk of serving at the summit table, but she had not anticipated the danger multiplying so quickly, from 2 directions at once, threatening to expose her secret before she had any chance to prepare a defense. "Thank you for telling me," Elena said quietly. "I should retire for the evening. Tomorrow will be a long day." Mira nodded and left her alone once more, and Elena sat in the small dark closet for several more minutes, her mind turning over every possible outcome, every path forward that might keep her safe. She could request reassignment to a distant wing of the palace, far from both the king's suspicious gaze and Draven Cole's dangerous presence. She could feign illness for the remainder of the summit, staying hidden in her small room until the northern delegations departed and the immediate danger passed. Or she could do what she had always done, what had kept her alive for 10 years despite every obstacle fate placed in her path. She could hold perfectly still, trust in the mask she had built with such careful precision, and pray that it held long enough for the danger to pass her by once more. She rose from the small stool in the linen closet and made her way back toward her room, her steps measured and careful despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. As she passed through the darkened servants' corridor, she caught sight of a tall figure standing near the far window, silhouetted against the pale moonlight streaming through the glass. Cain Ashworth turned at the sound of her footsteps, his golden eyes finding hers in the dim light, before she remembered to look away. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them, heavy with questions neither was ready to ask aloud. "You should be resting," Cain said finally, his voice quiet in the empty corridor. "As should you, my king," Elena replied, forcing lightness into her tone despite the tension coiling in her chest. Cain took a step closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar clinging to his dark clothing. "Lord Cole seemed quite interested in your face tonight," he said carefully. "I could not help but wonder why a man like that would take such notice of a servant girl." Elena's heart pounded painfully against her ribs, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, her gaze drifting past his shoulder in practiced emptiness. "I could not say, my king. Perhaps he simply enjoys frightening those who cannot see him coming." "Perhaps," Cain said softly, though the word carried the weight of a man who did not believe it for a single moment. "Good night, Elena." "Good night, my king," she whispered, and hurried past him toward the safety of her small room, her heart racing the entire way, painfully aware that the careful walls she had built around herself were beginning, slowly but surely, to crumble. Corwin Blake returned to the king's study 3 days after the summit feast, a leather folder clutched tightly beneath his arm, his usually composed expression tight with something close to alarm. "My king," he said, closing the heavy door behind him before speaking further, "I have found what you asked me to find, and I fear you will not like what it reveals." Cain looked up from the maps spread across his desk, his golden eyes sharpening with immediate attention. "Tell me." Corwin set the folder down and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old letters and faded records he had gathered from the palace archives. 12 years ago, a small pack known as the Voss family held territory along the western border, a minor bloodline, but a respected one, known for healing arts and old wisdom, passed through their line for generations. Within the span of a single season, the entire family was destroyed. Only rumors of a surviving daughter ever circulated afterward, though most believed she perished in the same attack that killed her mother. Cain's chest tightened with a feeling he could not quite name. And Draven Cole? Cole took control of the Voss territory less than a month after the attack, Corwin said grimly. There were whispers even then that he orchestrated the entire massacre himself, eliminating a family whose healing gifts and old alliances threatened his growing influence in the north. Nothing was ever proven. The surviving records are incomplete, and no witnesses ever came forward. Cain rose from his desk and crossed to the window, staring out over the palace grounds, as the pieces of a terrible puzzle began arranging themselves in his mind. A surviving daughter, a servant girl who moved with impossible certainty, despite her claimed blindness. A dangerous flicker of recognition between that same servant girl and the very man rumored to have destroyed her family. "Elena Voss," he murmured, testing the shape of the realization in his mouth. "My king?" Corwin asked, confusion creasing his brow. "The servant girl," Cain said, turning back to face his advisor, his voice low and urgent. "Her name is Elena Voss. I did not think anything of it before, a common enough name, but now I wonder if it is not common at all." Corwin's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You believe she is the surviving daughter?" "I believe," Cain said slowly, "that a girl who was supposedly blinded as a child might instead have spent 10 years pretending to be blind, hiding in plain sight from the very man who murdered her family, and would gladly finish what he started, if he ever recognized her." The weight of the realization settled heavily over the room, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Cain thought of Elena's steady hands, her unnervingly precise movements, the flash of clear recognition he had glimpsed in her eyes, before she buried it beneath practiced emptiness. He thought of the fear that had radiated from her at the summit feast, when Draven Cole gripped her wrist. Fear that made far more sense now than it had before. "If this is true," Corwin said carefully, She has committed a serious deception, my king. Palace law requires that any hidden identity within these walls be reported immediately, particularly one connected to enemies of allied pacts. If it is discovered that you knew and said nothing, it could be seen as harboring a fugitive against treaty obligations. I am aware of the law, Corwin, Kane said, his jaw tight. I helped write half of it myself. Then what will you do? Kane did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting back toward the window, toward the distant rooftops of the servants' quarters where Elena likely moved through her daily duties at this very moment, entirely unaware that her carefully guarded secret had just been laid bare before the one man capable of destroying her life with a single word. Nothing, for now, Kane said finally. I want to speak with her myself before any action is taken. If she truly is the last surviving Voss, she has spent 10 years living in fear beneath my own roof, and I will not condemn her without understanding the full truth first. Corwin studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. You care for this girl, he said quietly. It was not quite a question. I care for the truth, Kane said, though even he heard the way the words rang slightly hollow, incomplete somehow, missing something he was not yet ready to name aloud. That evening, Kane sought Elena out in the palace gardens once more, sending word through Mira that he wished to speak with her privately after her duties concluded. Elena arrived at the fountain just as dusk settled over the grounds, her steps as measured and careful as always, though Kane thought he detected a new tension in her shoulders, a wariness that suggested she sensed something had shifted since their last conversation. You wish to speak with me, my king? She asked, settling onto the familiar stone bench, her gaze drifting past his shoulder in practiced emptiness. Kane did not sit beside her this time. Instead, he remained standing, studying her face in the fading light, searching for any trace of the frightened child described in Corwin's old records, buried somewhere beneath the calm composure she wore like a second skin. I know who you are, he said quietly. Elena's entire body went rigid, though she fought valiantly to keep her expression neutral, her breathing carefully controlled despite the sudden roar of panic flooding through her veins. I do not understand, my king. I am simply a servant in your household. Elena Voss, Kane said, watching closely as the name landed like a physical blow, her composure cracking for just a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. Daughter of the Voss healing line, presumed dead these past 10 years, alongside the rest of your family. Elena rose from the bench slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, her carefully unfocused gaze finally, helplessly, snapping into sharp and desperate focus on his face. Please, she whispered, all pretense abandoned now, her voice raw with a fear she had suppressed for a decade. Please, my king, I beg you not to speak of this to anyone. If Draven Cole learns the truth, he will finish what he started 12 years ago. The confirmation, spoken aloud at last from her own trembling lips, settled something heavy and certain in Kane's chest. He had suspected the truth for days, but hearing it confirmed, seeing the genuine terror in her clear, sharp eyes that saw everything with perfect clarity, struck him harder than he expected. You have nothing to fear from me, Kane said, his voice softening as he stepped closer. I have no intention of exposing you to Cole or anyone else. You do not understand, Elena said, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, though she fought fiercely to hold them back. Palace law requires you to report any hidden identity connected to enemy bloodlines. If it becomes known that you knew and said nothing, your own crown could be at risk. I cannot ask you to carry that danger for my sake. You did not ask, Kane said quietly. I offer it freely. Elena stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that his kindness concealed some hidden motive she had not yet uncovered. But she found nothing except quiet sincerity, a steadiness in his golden gaze that made something long frozen inside her chest begin, slowly and painfully, to thaw. Why would you risk so much for a servant girl you barely know? She whispered. Kane considered the question carefully before answering, his eyes never leaving hers. Because I have watched you move through this palace for days now, carrying a decade of grief and fear behind a mask so perfect that an entire kingdom of clever, suspicious people never once questioned it. That takes a kind of strength I do not often see, Elena Voss. I find I am not willing to let such strength be destroyed, simply because the law demands it. Elena's breath caught, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither was fully prepared to name. Finally, she nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes, forcing her composure back into place, though her true, clear gaze remained fixed on his face, for the first time in 10 years without any pretense of blindness hiding it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your mercy and your silence." "Do not thank me yet," Kane said, his expression turning grave once more. "Draven Cole remains in this palace for the duration of the summit, and I fear he will not simply forget the strange familiarity he sensed in your face. We must be careful, Elena, more careful than ever before." "I have survived 10 years of careful," Elena said, a faint, fragile smile touching her lips, despite the danger still coiled around them both. "I suppose I can manage a few weeks more." Kane studied her for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar settling behind his ribs, a feeling he did not yet have a name for but suspected. With quiet unease, he would come to know very well before this was over. "Then we manage it together," he said quietly, and Elena, for the first time in a decade, allowed herself to believe that perhaps she was no longer facing the danger entirely alone. The lanterns went out all at once, plunging the entire eastern wing of the palace into sudden, suffocating darkness, and the first sound Elena heard afterward was a child screaming. She had been carrying a tray of linens down the corridor near the guest chambers when the lights failed, and for one disorienting moment, even her own sharp eyes struggled to adjust to the abrupt blackness. Shouts erupted from every direction, servants and guards alike stumbling blindly through hallways they had walked 1,000 times before, now rendered unfamiliar by the absence of light. Somewhere above her, a heavy groan of splitting wood echoed through the ceiling beams, followed immediately by that same terrified scream, high and young and unmistakably close. Elena dropped the tray of linens without a second thought and ran toward the sound. Her eyes adjusted almost instantly to the darkness, far faster than any ordinary person's could, and she moved through the chaos, with a speed and certainty that would have been impossible to explain, had anyone been watching closely enough to notice. She rounded the corner into the small alcove near the guest quarters and saw him immediately, a young boy no older than 6, frozen in place beneath a massive ceiling beam that groaned and shifted dangerously above him, weakened by whatever sabotage had caused the lanterns to fail in the first place. "Toby!" a woman's voice screamed from somewhere further down the hall, one of the visiting delegation's attendants, her voice cracking with panic as she stumbled blindly toward a child she could not see and could not reach in time. Elena did not hesitate. She crossed the distance in 3 swift strides, wrapped her arms around the frozen, terrified boy, and pulled him backward with every ounce of strength she possessed, just as the beam gave way entirely, crashing down onto the exact spot where he had stood only a heartbeat before. Dust and splinters exploded outward, and Elena curled her body protectively around the sobbing child, shielding him from the worst of the debris as it settled around them. "You are safe," she whispered against his hair, her own heart pounding wildly from the near miss. "You are safe now." It was only when the dust began to clear and the first emergency torches were carried into the corridor that Elena realized her mistake, cold horror flooding through her veins, even as relief for the boy's safety still hummed in her chest. She had moved through complete darkness without a single moment of hesitation. She had located a frightened child hidden in shadow, calculated the trajectory of a falling beam, and pulled him to safety with the speed and precision of someone who could see every detail with perfect clarity. No blind woman, however skilled, could have accomplished what she had just done. And Kane Ashworth, running toward the commotion with a torch held high in his own hand, had arrived just in time to see every second of it. He stopped dead in the corridor, torchlight flickering across his stunned face as he took in the scene before him, Elena kneeling protectively over the crying boy, her body angled with perfect precision to have shielded him from the falling debris, her movements far too swift and certain to belong to anyone who could not see. Their eyes met across the debris-strewn hallway, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Elena's chest heaved with exertion, her carefully maintained mask entirely forgotten in the aftermath of the crisis, her clear and desperate gaze locked directly onto his, betraying everything she had spent 10 years hiding. The boy's mother reached them then, sobbing with relief as she gathered her son into her arms, showering thanks upon Elena that barely registered through the roaring in her ears. Guards flooded the corridor moments later, torches multiplying the light until the full extent of the damage became visible. A support beam collapsed entirely, clearly the result of deliberate tampering, rather than simple decay. Someone weakened this beam on purpose and cut the lantern oil lines at the same moment. This was planned. Kane barely heard the words, his attention still fixed entirely on Elena, who had finally managed to school her expression back into practiced calm, though it was far too late to undo what he had already witnessed. He crossed the corridor slowly, kneeling beside her under the guise of checking on the rescued boy, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "You saw everything," he murmured. "Every inch of this hallway, in complete darkness." "My king," Elena whispered back, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Please, not here." Kane straightened and addressed the gathered guards and servants with practiced authority, his voice carrying easily through the anxious crowd. "Secure this section of the palace. I want every inch of the eastern wing searched for further tampering, and I want the lantern oil supply inspected immediately. Whoever did this may still be within these walls." The guards scattered to their tasks, and the boy's mother carried her still trembling son away toward safety, leaving Kane and Elena alone, amid the wreckage of the fallen beam, torchlight casting long, flickering shadows across the debris. "We need to speak," Kane said quietly. "Somewhere private. Immediately." Elena nodded, too shaken to argue, and followed him through a side passage toward his private study, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. 10 years of careful discipline, shattered in a single desperate moment because a child's life had mattered more to her than her own carefully guarded secret. Once inside the study, Kane closed the heavy door and turned to face her, his expression a complicated mixture of concern and something else, something that looked almost like admiration despite the gravity of the situation. "You could have let the guards handle it," he said quietly. "You could have stayed hidden in the darkness and let someone else reach him." "I could not," Elena said simply, her voice steadier now, though exhaustion pulled heavily at her limbs. "I have spent my entire life being someone who could not act, who had to stand silent and helpless while others suffered around me. I will not become that person again. Not when a child's life hangs in the balance, whatever the cost to my own safety." Kane studied her for a long moment, something warm and fierce kindling behind his golden eyes. "Whoever sabotaged that beam meant to hurt someone tonight, perhaps many people. This was no accident, Elena, and I fear it may be connected to Draven Cole's presence within these walls." "You believe he is planning something," Elena said, understanding dawning quickly. "I believe," Kane said grimly, "that a man capable of destroying an entire bloodline for the sake of territory is entirely capable of orchestrating chaos within my own palace, particularly if he suspects that the daughter he failed to kill 12 years ago might be hiding somewhere close at hand." Elena's blood ran cold at the implication. "You think tonight's sabotage was meant for me?" "I do not yet know," Kane admitted, "but I intend to find out, and until I do, I want you kept safe, closely watched, protected from whatever danger circles closer with each passing day." "I have protected myself for 10 years without assistance," Elena said, though the words carried less conviction than they might have a week earlier, before Kane Ashworth had begun steadily dismantling the careful walls she had built around her heart, as well as her secret. "I do not doubt your strength," Kane said, stepping closer, his voice softening. "But you no longer face this danger alone, Elena. Whatever comes next, I intend to stand beside you, not merely as your king, but as someone who has come to care for you far more deeply than either of us anticipated when this began." Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words, and for a long moment, she allowed herself simply to look at him, truly look at him, without any pretense of blindness hiding her gaze. She saw the sincerity etched into every line of his face, the quiet determination that had carried him through the sudden burden of a crown he had not expected to wear so soon, the same determination now bent entirely toward protecting her. "I am frightened," she admitted softly, the confession costing her more than any lie ever had. "I have hidden for so long that I do not know how to stop, even now, even with you." "Then let me help you learn," Kane said quietly, reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "One careful step at a time, together, until the fear no longer holds such power over you." Elena did not pull away from his touch, though every instinct built over 10 years of careful discipline urged her toward caution. Instead, she allowed herself, just this once, to lean slightly into the warmth of his presence, drawing strength from a connection she had never permitted herself to want before tonight. Outside the study window, guards continued their search through the damaged eastern wing, torchlight flickering against the darkness, as they hunted for evidence of sabotage and the hidden enemy who had orchestrated it. Somewhere within those same palace walls, Draven Cole slept soundly in his guest chambers, entirely unaware that the King of Ashworth had already begun piecing together a truth that would soon threaten everything he had built upon the bones of a destroyed bloodline. The danger, both of them understood without needing to speak it aloud, had only just begun. The investigation into the sabotaged beam yielded little in the days that followed, though Kane assigned his most trusted guards to watch the eastern wing around the clock, and Corwin Blake quietly expanded his inquiry into Draven Cole's movements throughout the palace since his arrival. Elena, meanwhile, found herself caught in a strange new existence, no longer entirely alone with her secret, yet still forced to maintain the same exhausting performance of blindness before every other set of eyes within the palace walls. "You seem different lately," Mira observed one afternoon as they folded linens together in the servants' quarters, her voice carrying gentle curiosity rather than suspicion. Lighter, somehow, despite everything that happened with the beam. "I suppose surviving such a close call changes a person's perspective," Elena said carefully, though the truth ran far deeper than she could safely share, even with her closest friend in the palace. The truth was this: for the first time in 10 years, Elena was not entirely alone with the weight of her secret. Kane sought her out whenever his duties allowed, always with careful discretion, always in places where prying eyes could not easily observe them together. Sometimes they spoke in the gardens after dusk, sometimes in his private study, under the guise of discussing palace matters, and slowly, cautiously, Elena found herself sharing pieces of her past she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. She told him about her mother's gentle hands, skilled in the old healing arts passed down through generations of Voss women, arts that had made their small pack both respected and, ultimately, dangerously valuable to a man like Draven Cole who feared any influence that might rival his own growing power. She told him about the night of the attack, the smell of smoke thick in the summer air, her mother's desperate final instructions to run and never look back. She told him about 3 days hidden beneath a fallen log, surviving on rainwater and quiet terror, and the old healer woman who found her half-starved and taught her the secret that had kept her alive ever since. Kane listened to every word without judgment, his expression carrying only quiet compassion and a growing fierce protectiveness that Elena found herself leaning on more heavily than she ever intended to allow. "You have carried this alone for far too long," he told her one evening in the gardens, the fountain murmuring softly beside them as darkness settled over the grounds. "I wish you had not needed to carry it alone at all." "I did not know any other way," Elena admitted. "Trust became a luxury I could not afford, not when the wrong person discovering my secret might cost me my life." "And now?" Kane asked quietly, watching her face with careful attention. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "Now I find myself trusting a king I barely know, with a secret that could cost him his crown should it ever come to light. I am not entirely certain that makes me wise." "Perhaps not wise," Kane agreed with a faint smile, "but I find myself grateful for it regardless." Their conversations grew steadily more personal as the days passed, drifting away from the danger surrounding them towards smaller, gentler subjects. The particular way Elena still remembered the color of autumn leaves, despite 10 years of pretending she could not see them at all. The quiet burden Kane carried, as a young king thrust suddenly into power he had not expected to hold so soon. The loneliness that came with a crown that demanded constant vigilance and left little room for genuine connection. It was during one such conversation, several days after the incident with the fallen beam, that Elena finally allowed herself to voice a fear that had been growing steadily within her since the night Kane first confronted her with the truth of her identity. "Draven Cole watches me," she said quietly, staring into the fountain's rippling water rather than meeting Kane's eyes. "I feel it whenever he passes near the kitchens, though he has said nothing further since the summit feast. I fear he suspects something, even if he cannot yet name what it is." Kane's jaw tightened at the admission. "I have noticed the same watchfulness in him, though he has been careful to give no outward sign of his suspicions to my advisors. Corwin believes he may be waiting for further proof before acting on whatever he suspects. What proof could he possibly find? Elena asked, worry creasing her brow. I have been careful, more careful than ever before, since the night of the beam. I do not know, Kane admitted, but men like Cole rarely act without certainty, and I fear he intends to manufacture whatever proof he requires, rather than simply accept the absence of it. Elena's hands trembled slightly in her lap, and Kane reached over without hesitation, covering her fingers gently with his own, offering silent comfort in the fading evening light. Whatever proof he seeks, Kane said firmly, he will not find it easily. I have instructed my most trusted guards to watch him closely, and I will not allow him to harm you, Elena, whatever it costs me to prevent it. You risk too much for my sake, Elena said softly, though she did not pull her hand away from his. I risk exactly as much as I choose to risk, Kane replied, his golden eyes steady and sincere. And I have chosen, quite deliberately, to risk a great deal where you are concerned. The quiet intimacy of the moment stretched between them, charged with an unspoken understanding that had been building steadily since the night in the war room, when Kane first noticed her hand moving, with impossible certainty, toward a cup she supposedly could not see. Elena studied his face in the fading light, searching, as she often did now, for any hint of deception or hidden motive beneath his careful kindness. She found none, only the same steady sincerity that had slowly, cautiously, begun dismantling 10 years of careful isolation she had built around her heart. I have not allowed myself to care for anyone in a very long time, Elena admitted quietly, the confession costing her considerable courage. Caring for someone means having something precious to lose, and I have lost enough already. I understand that fear better than you might expect, Kane said, his voice gentle. I lost my father suddenly, with no warning, and no chance to prepare for the weight of the crown he left behind. I have spent every day since, wondering whether I am equal to the burden he entrusted to me, terrified of failing the people who depend upon my judgment. You do not seem like a man afraid of failure, Elena said softly. I am afraid of very little that involves swords or strategy, Kane admitted with a faint, self-deprecating smile. But I confess, Elena Voss, that you frighten me rather more than any enemy army ever has. Elena's breath caught at the honesty in his words, and despite every careful instinct urging caution, she found herself leaning slightly closer to him, drawn by a warmth she had denied herself for 10 long years. Why would I frighten a king who commands armies and negotiates with dangerous alphas without hesitation? Because, Kane said quietly, his gaze steady on hers, you make me want things I did not expect to want, so soon after taking this crown. Safety, partnership, a quiet evening in a garden that has nothing whatsoever to do with treaties or borders, or the endless demands of ruling a kingdom. The words settled warmly in Elena's chest, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fountain's gentle murmur the only sound in the peaceful darkness surrounding them. Finally, Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first she had permitted herself in longer than she could easily remember. Perhaps, she said softly, we might risk wanting such things together, carefully, one evening at a time. Kane's answering smile was warm and unguarded, a rare expression from a king who carried such heavy burdens upon his shoulders. I would like that very much, he said quietly. Neither of them noticed the shadow that shifted briefly near the garden wall, nor the pair of watchful eyes that observed their quiet exchange with growing, calculating interest, before withdrawing silently back into the darkness of the palace grounds. The summons came without warning, delivered by a stone-faced guard, who informed Elena that advisor Corwin Blake required her presence in the small council chamber immediately, a request that sent icy dread flooding through her veins the moment she heard it. She had not spoken with Corwin directly since the night of the summit feast, and something in the guard's carefully neutral expression told her this was no ordinary summons. She followed him through the palace corridors with her usual measured steps, her mind racing through every possible reason the king's most trusted advisor might wish to speak with her alone, none of the possibilities offering any comfort. Corwin waited for her in the small council chamber, seated behind a heavy wooden desk covered in papers and old records, his expression grave as she entered, and the guard closed the door behind her, leaving them alone. Please, sit, Corwin said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. Elena obeyed, keeping her expression carefully neutral, despite the pounding of her heart. "I know the truth of your identity," Corwin said without preamble, watching her face closely for any reaction. "The king confided in me some days ago, after I discovered records connecting you to the Voss bloodline destroyed 12 years past." Elena's composure cracked slightly, despite her best efforts, though she said nothing, waiting to learn what consequence this conversation might bring. "I do not tell you this to frighten you," Corwin continued, his tone softening slightly. "I tell you because I believe you deserve to understand the full danger of your situation, danger that extends beyond simple discovery by Lord Cole." "What do you mean?" Elena asked carefully. Corwin leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were entirely alone. "Palace law requires that any hidden identity connected to enemies of allied pacts be reported to the full council, immediately upon discovery. The king has chosen to withhold this information, protecting you at considerable personal risk. Should this ever come to light, particularly during a delicate treaty negotiation with the very pact Cole now leads, it could be seen as a serious breach of trust between our kingdom and the Northern Alliance. I understand the risk I have placed upon him," Elena said quietly. "I have urged him more than once to consider his own safety before mine." "I do not doubt that you have," Corwin said, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "But I confess, Elena Voss, that I find myself curious about your own feelings in this matter. The king has grown noticeably attached to you these past weeks, attachment that concerns me greatly, given the political weight balanced so precariously upon this treaty summit." Elena's cheeks warmed slightly, despite the gravity of the conversation. "I care for him," she admitted honestly, seeing little point in denying what Corwin had clearly already observed, "more than I expected to allow myself to care for anyone." Corwin nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then I hope, for both your sakes, that your feelings prove worth the risk you are both undertaking. Because I fear, Elena, that Lord Cole grows increasingly suspicious of you, and increasingly aware of the king's unusual attention toward a mere servant girl. It will not take much longer before he begins to ask questions neither of you wish to answer." "What would you have me do?" Elena asked, fear tightening once more in her chest. "I do not yet know," Corwin admitted, "but I wished you to understand the full weight of what hangs in the balance, so that whatever choices lie ahead, you make them with clear eyes, rather than false comfort." Elena left the council chamber with Corwin's warning echoing heavily in her mind, and she sought out Kane later that evening in his private study, finding him bent over maps and correspondence, his brow furrowed with the weight of governing a kingdom still fractured by old rivalries and new threats. "Corwin spoke with me today," she said without preamble, closing the study door behind her. Kane looked up immediately, setting aside his papers with obvious concern. "About what?" "About the danger we have placed you in," Elena said, crossing the room to stand before his desk. "He believes Draven Cole grows suspicious of your attention toward me, suspicious enough that he may soon act on it, regardless of what proof he actually possesses." Kane's jaw tightened, though he did not seem entirely surprised by the warning. "I have suspected as much myself these past days. Cole has requested additional private meetings with my council, meetings that seem designed more to probe for information than to discuss any genuine treaty terms. Perhaps I should withdraw from the palace entirely," Elena said, the words costing her considerable pain despite their practical necessity. "If I disappear quietly, claim illness or family obligation elsewhere, perhaps his suspicions will fade along with my absence." "No," Kane said firmly, rising from his desk to stand before her. "I will not allow you to disappear into hiding once more, Elena. Not after everything you have already sacrificed to survive these past 10 years. There must be another way to protect you that does not require abandoning the life you have finally begun building within these walls." "What life?" Elena asked, bitter frustration edging into her voice. "A decade of pretending to be someone I am not, followed now by weeks of hiding an even more dangerous truth from an enemy who murdered my entire family? I do not know what life you believe I am building, my king, but it feels remarkably similar to the same fear I have carried since I was 7 years old." Kane's expression softened at the raw pain in her words, and he reached out gently, cupping her face in his warm hands, forcing her to meet his steady gaze. "The life you are building includes someone who cares for you deeply, Elena, someone who intends to see you finally free of the fear that has haunted you for far too long. I cannot promise the path forward will be simple, but I can promise you will not walk it alone any longer." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She had not permitted herself in longer than she could remember, and she leaned into his touch, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence. "I am so tired of being afraid," she whispered. "Then let us find a way to end that fear permanently," Cain said quietly, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "Draven Cole destroyed your family and stole your childhood. Elena, I do not intend to let him steal anything more from you, including whatever future we might build together." "And if exposing the truth costs you your crown?" Elena asked, searching his face for any hint of hesitation. "Then I will have lost a crown while gaining something far more valuable," Cain said simply. "A crown can be rebuilt or passed to another worthy successor. What I feel for you, Elena Voss, is not so easily replaced." The confession settled warmly between them, and Elena finally allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that whatever danger lay ahead, she no longer faced it as an isolated girl hiding behind careful lies. She faced it as a woman who had found, against every expectation forged by 10 years of fear, someone willing to stand beside her regardless of the cost. "Then let us prepare together," she said softly, "for whatever comes next." Cain pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a small gesture that carried the weight of every unspoken promise, building steadily between them. "Whatever comes next," he agreed quietly, "we face it together." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment of shared resolve, that Draven Cole had already begun setting a far more dangerous trap in motion, one designed not merely to expose Elena's identity, but to use that exposure as a weapon capable of destroying the young king's entire reign in a single devastating stroke. Whispers began circulating through the palace within days, quiet murmurs among the guards and servants that the king had grown strangely attached to a blind serving girl, spending far more time in her company than propriety or reason seemed to allow. Elena felt the weight of those whispers everywhere she walked, sensed eyes following her through the corridors with new and uncomfortable interest, and she understood, with growing dread, that Draven Cole had likely planted the very first seeds of that gossip himself. "You must be more careful," Corwin warned Cain one afternoon in the privacy of the royal study, his expression grim with concern. "The northern delegations have taken notice of the rumors, and Lord Cole in particular seems entirely too pleased by their spread. I fear he intends to use this gossip as leverage against you during the final treaty negotiations." "What leverage could rumors possibly provide him?" Cain asked, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he already understood the danger better than he wished to admit. "If he can demonstrate that the King of Ashworth harbors unusual affection for a servant girl whose true identity remains hidden," Corwin said carefully, "he gains considerable power to demand concessions during negotiations, threatening exposure should you refuse his terms. Worse still, if he ever proves that girl to be the last surviving Voss heir, he gains justification to demand her surrender under old pack law regarding unresolved bloodline conflicts." Cain's blood ran cold at the implication. He would use ancient law to claim ownership over her fate? "Draven Cole has never hesitated to twist old traditions toward his own advantage," Corwin said grimly. "I would not put such a strategy beyond him, particularly if he believes it might simultaneously destroy your credibility as king, while eliminating the final threat to his stolen territory." The warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, during a formal council session attended by representatives from all 3 northern delegations, Draven Cole rose from his seat with deliberate calm, addressing the assembled council with practiced authority. "I wish to raise a delicate matter before this council," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, "regarding unresolved business connected to the Voss bloodline conflict of 12 years past." Cain's entire body went rigid at the head of the table, though he forced his expression to remain carefully neutral, giving away nothing of the dread coiling tightly in his chest. "I was unaware any business remained unresolved from a conflict so long settled, Lord Cole." "Perhaps you are unaware," Draven said smoothly, "because the matter has only recently come to my attention. I have reason to believe the final surviving member of that bloodline yet lives, hidden somewhere within these very palace walls, disguised in a manner clever enough to have escaped notice for a decade." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, and Cain felt every eye in the chamber turning toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to the dangerous accusation hanging heavily in the air. He kept his expression carefully composed, giving nothing away despite the frantic calculations racing through his mind. "That is a serious claim, Lord Cole," Kane said evenly. "What evidence supports it?" "A servant girl within your household," Draven said, his eyes glittering with dangerous satisfaction, "who claims blindness, yet moves with a certainty no truly blind person could possess. A girl who bears a striking resemblance to the Voss family, and who I myself observed reacting with unmistakable recognition when confronted with my presence at the summit feast." "Suspicion is not evidence," Kane said firmly, though sweat gathered at the back of his neck despite the coolness of the chamber. "I will not condemn any member of my household based on mere resemblance and rumor." "Then perhaps," Draven said, his smile turning sharp and cold, "we should summon this servant girl before the full council, and allow her to answer for herself. If she is truly blind and truly innocent of any hidden identity, she has nothing to fear from such an inquiry." The trap closed with terrible precision, leaving Kane no reasonable path to refuse, without appearing to shield her deliberately, an act that would only confirm every suspicion Draven Cole had already voiced before the assembled delegations. Kane exchanged a brief, desperate glance with Corwin, both men understanding the impossible position now closing tightly around them. "Very well," Kane said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. "The girl shall be summoned, and she shall answer whatever questions this council deems necessary." Elena received the summons less than an hour later, delivered by a grim-faced Mira, whose hands trembled as she relayed the terrible news. "The full council wishes to question you," Mira whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "Lord Cole has accused you before the entire chamber, Elena. I do not know what to do." Elena's blood ran cold, though a strange, steady calm settled over her as the shock of the news began to fade. 10 years of careful preparation had led inevitably toward this exact moment, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer felt entirely paralyzed by the fear that had governed her existence for so long. "I will answer the summons," she said quietly, straightening her shoulders with quiet resolve. "Whatever comes of it." She walked through the palace corridors toward the council chamber with measured, deliberate steps, her mind racing through every possible strategy that might yet preserve both her life and Kane's crown from the destruction Draven Cole intended to unleash. She thought of her mother's final words, urging her to run and survive whatever cost such survival demanded. She thought of 10 years, spent perfecting a mask so complete that even a suspicious king had required weeks to fully unravel it. And she thought of Kane, standing at the head of that council chamber, risking everything he had built to protect a truth he had chosen to shield rather than expose. She would not let his sacrifice be wasted through her own fear. The council chamber fell silent as she entered, every eye in the room fixed upon her, weighing and measuring, searching for any confirmation of the dangerous accusation Draven Cole had leveled against her. Elena kept her gaze carefully soft and unfocused, her steps measured with practiced uncertainty, giving no outward sign of the terror pounding beneath her calm exterior. "Elena Voss," Draven Cole said, rising once more from his seat, his voice carrying dangerous satisfaction as he addressed her directly before the assembled council. "I have accused you of hiding your true identity beneath false claims of blindness. What do you say in your own defense?" Elena felt every gaze in the chamber settling upon her, felt the weight of 10 years, balanced precariously on the edge of this single, terrible moment. She glanced briefly toward Kane, seated at the head of the table, his golden eyes steady and fierce, with unspoken support, despite the impossible danger surrounding them both. "My lord," Elena said finally, her voice steady and clear despite the storm raging within her, "I will answer whatever questions this council requires. But I ask, before I speak further, that you tell this chamber the full truth of what happened to the Voss family 12 years ago, and your own role in the destruction of that bloodline." A stunned silence fell over the chamber, and Draven Cole's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that looked remarkably like uncertainty. The trap he had so carefully constructed had just been turned, unexpectedly and dangerously, back upon himself. Draven Cole recovered his composure quickly, though the brief flicker of uncertainty had not escaped the notice of the assembled council, several members exchanging quiet, curious glances at the unexpected turn the confrontation had taken. "I do not know what you mean," Draven said smoothly, though a slight edge had crept into his voice that had not been present moments before. "I had no role in the destruction of the Voss bloodline, beyond inheriting territory left vacant by their unfortunate demise." "Unfortunate demise," Elena repeated quietly, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even herself. "My lord, I was a child of 7 years, when my family was slaughtered in a single night, our home burned to ash, our healing hall destroyed, along with 3 generations of knowledge and history. I watched my own mother die trying to protect me from men who wore your household colors and carried your personal seal upon their weapons." The chamber erupted into murmurs, council members shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the weight of Elena's words settled over the room. Kane watched from the head of the table, his heart pounding with a dangerous mixture of fear and fierce protective pride, as Elena finally spoke the truth she had carried silently for a decade. "You admit, then, that you are indeed the surviving daughter of that bloodline," Draven said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "I admit that I have hidden my true identity for 10 years, Elena said clearly, because the man responsible for murdering my entire family sat within these very palace walls, wearing the same silver ring I watched him wear the night my mother died protecting me. I admit that I disguised myself as blind because I learned, at 7 years old, that survival sometimes requires becoming invisible to those who wish you destroyed." "These are serious accusations without proof," Draven said sharply, though sweat had begun gathering visibly at his temple despite the coolness of the chamber. "A frightened child's memory, distorted by years of trauma, hardly constitutes reliable testimony before this council." "Then perhaps," Corwin Blake interjected suddenly, rising from his seat near the king, "this council should examine the records I have gathered regarding the Voss family's destruction, and the suspicious speed with which Lord Cole assumed control of their abandoned territory immediately afterward." A murmur of surprise rippled through the chamber as Corwin produced the leather folder he had shown Kane days earlier, laying out the old letters and faded records before the assembled council members. Draven's composure cracked further as several council representatives leaned forward, examining the documents with growing interest and concern. "These records prove nothing beyond simple timing," Draven insisted, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Territory changes hands quickly in the wake of any pack's destruction. That alone does not prove I orchestrated the attack." "Perhaps not alone," Kane said, finally rising from his seat at the head of the table, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "But combined with Elena's testimony, and the additional evidence my advisor has gathered regarding at least 3 other minor bloodlines eliminated during your rise to power, a rather troubling pattern begins to emerge, Lord Cole." Draven's eyes narrowed dangerously, his careful mask finally slipping to reveal the calculating cruelty beneath it. "You would accuse a fellow alpha before an assembled treaty council, based on the word of a servant girl, and a handful of old letters? This is a dangerous game you play, Ashworth, one that could easily unravel the very alliance you claim to value so highly." "I value truth and justice considerably more than I value an alliance built upon the bones of murdered families," Kane said firmly, his golden eyes hard with unwavering resolve. "If you believe otherwise, Lord Cole, then perhaps you have fundamentally misunderstood the kind of king you are dealing with." The chamber fell into tense silence, every council member watching the confrontation unfold with rapt attention, the fate of the treaty summit, and possibly far more hanging precariously in the balance. Elena stood quietly beside the council table, her heart pounding wildly, though a fierce, unexpected courage had settled over her in place of the fear that had governed her existence for so long. "There is one further matter," Elena said suddenly, drawing every eye once more toward her. "My Lord Cole wears a ring, silver with ruby eyes shaped like a wolf's head, a ring I watched him wear the night he murdered my mother. That same ring bears an inscription along its inner band, a mark unique to a particular smith, whose records, I believe, still exist within the Northern Territories, should this council wish to verify its true age and ownership." Draven's hand moved instinctively to cover the ring on his finger, a reaction that did not escape the notice of anyone in the chamber. The gesture alone, small and involuntary, spoke louder than any words could have managed, confirming the truth of Elena's accusation more thoroughly than any document possibly could. "Remove the ring, Lord Cole," Kane said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its calm delivery. "Allow this council to examine it and verify the truth of what Elena has claimed." For a long, tense moment, Draven Cole remained frozen, his eyes darting between the assembled council members, calculating his rapidly narrowing options. Finally, recognizing the impossibility of his position, he removed the ring with visibly trembling hands and set it upon the council table. His earlier confidence entirely collapsed into something closer to desperate calculation. "Even if this ring proves what the girl claims," Draven said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "you cannot prove I personally ordered the attack that destroyed her family. Perhaps the ring was stolen, or gifted, or acquired through means entirely unconnected to that night's violence." "Perhaps," Kane agreed evenly, "but I suspect a thorough investigation into your household guard from 12 years past, cross-referenced against the survivors and witnesses who may yet remember that terrible night, will reveal considerably more than you would prefer this council to uncover." Draven's jaw tightened, understanding fully now that the careful trap he had constructed to expose and destroy Elena had instead collapsed entirely around his own dangerous secrets. He glanced toward the chamber doors, calculating the odds of escape, before recognizing the guards stationed there under Kane's earlier quiet instructions, anticipating exactly this possibility. "This council session is concluded," Kane announced firmly, addressing the assembled representatives with steady authority. "Lord Cole will remain within the palace under guard, while a full investigation proceeds into these serious allegations. Any northern delegation wishing to depart peacefully may do so, understanding that Ashworth's alliance depends entirely upon justice being properly served, regardless of rank or title." The council chamber erupted into a flurry of hushed conversation as guards moved to secure Draven Cole, his earlier confidence entirely shattered, replaced now by cornered, desperate fury. Elena watched the scene unfold with a strange, disbelieving calm, 10 years of carefully guarded fear, finally beginning to loosen its suffocating grip upon her chest. Kane crossed the chamber to stand beside her, his golden eyes warm despite the gravity of the moment, and Elena found herself, for the first time in a decade, standing fully visible before an entire room of witnesses, her true identity finally spoken aloud without disguise or deception. "You did it," Kane said quietly, his voice carrying quiet wonder and fierce pride in equal measure. "You faced him, Elena, after everything he took from you." "We did it," Elena corrected softly, her eyes meeting his without any trace of the practiced emptiness she had worn for 10 long years. "Together, exactly as you promised." Outside the council chamber windows, the first light of dawn began spreading gently across the palace grounds, illuminating a new day that neither of them could have fully imagined possible only weeks earlier, when Elena had still believed her survival depended entirely upon remaining invisible to the world around her. 3 weeks passed before the full investigation into Draven Cole's crimes reached its conclusion. Weeks during which Elena remained within the Ashworth Palace, under Kane's watchful protection, no longer hiding behind the careful mask of blindness she had worn for a full decade. The evidence, once thoroughly gathered, proved damning beyond any reasonable dispute. Corwin Blake's investigators located 2 surviving guards from Draven Cole's household who, upon learning of his impending downfall, finally came forward with testimony confirming his direct orders to eliminate the Voss bloodline 12 years earlier, along with disturbing accounts of at least 2 other minor pacts, similarly destroyed during his ruthless rise to power. The silver ring, examined by smiths within the Northern Territories, matched records confirming it had been crafted specifically for Draven Cole himself, definitively disproving any claim that it had been stolen or acquired through innocent means. Before the assembled Northern delegations and Ashworth's own council, Draven Cole was formally stripped of his territory and title, his crimes against the Voss bloodline and other destroyed pacts read aloud in full before witnesses from every corner of the Allied kingdoms. Justice, so long delayed, finally arrived for a family who had waited 12 years for their suffering to be acknowledged and answered. Elena stood beside Kane throughout the formal proceedings, no longer required to hide behind practiced emptiness, her clear, sharp eyes taking in every detail of the chamber with open, unguarded relief. The weight she had carried since childhood, the constant vigilance, the exhausting performance maintained through 1,000 small deceptions, finally began lifting from her shoulders as the final judgment was pronounced. The Voss territory, unclaimed these 12 years past, rightfully returns to its last surviving heir, the council's eldest representative announced formally, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. Elena Voss, daughter of the healing line, is hereby restored to her rightful place among the recognized packs of this alliance. The declaration settled over Elena with a weight she had never expected to feel again, a sense of belonging and legitimacy she had abandoned all hope of reclaiming during 10 long years of careful hiding. She glanced toward Cain, finding his golden eyes already fixed upon her, warm with quiet pride and something deeper still, something that had grown steadily between them through every shared danger and quiet confession of the weeks past. That evening, after the formal proceedings concluded and the northern delegations began their departure from the Ashworth Palace, Cain found Elena once more in the familiar gardens where so much of their careful, growing connection had first taken root. She stood beside the fountain, her face tilted upward toward the darkening sky, watching the first stars emerge, with open, unguarded wonder that no longer required any pretense of blindness to disguise. "You look at the stars as though you have never truly seen them before," Cain observed quietly, coming to stand beside her. "In a way, I have not," Elena admitted softly. "I spent so many years deliberately avoiding any expression of genuine sight that I forgot, somewhat, what it felt like to simply look at something beautiful without fear of who might be watching." Cain reached for her hand, lacing his fingers gently through hers, and Elena allowed the connection without hesitation, savoring the warmth of his touch, without any of the careful calculation that had governed every gesture of her existence for the past decade. "What will you do now?" Cain asked quietly. "With your territory restored and your enemy finally defeated, you are free, Elena, for the first time since you were a child, to choose whatever path you wish for your future." Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind as she gazed out across the peaceful garden grounds. "I could rebuild the Voss Healing Hall," she said slowly. "Restore what was lost 12 years ago. Carry forward the knowledge my mother and grandmother worked so hard to preserve. It feels like the right way to honor what Draven Cole tried so desperately to destroy." "That sounds like a worthy calling," Cain said warmly. "Though I confess, I find myself hoping your choice might also include remaining close to the Ashworth Palace, rather than departing entirely for the northern territories." Elena turned to face him fully, searching his expression with clear, unguarded eyes. "What are you asking, Cain?" Cain's expression grew serious, though warmth remained evident in every line of his face. "I am asking whether you might consider building your new life alongside mine, Elena. I have watched you survive unimaginable loss with a strength I have rarely witnessed in anyone. Watched you find courage to face your greatest enemy when the moment demanded it, and watched you slowly, cautiously, begin trusting again after 10 years of believing such trust impossible. I find myself deeply, thoroughly in love with the woman behind that careful mask, and I would be honored beyond words if you might consider standing beside me, not as a hidden secret, but as my equal and my mate before this entire kingdom." Elena's breath caught at the depth of sincerity behind his words, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, though they carried none of the fear that had accompanied every tear she had shed throughout the difficult weeks past. "You wish to claim me publicly," she whispered, "as your mate?" "I wish to claim you exactly as you are," Cain said firmly. "Elena Voss, daughter of a healing bloodline, survivor of unimaginable tragedy, and the bravest woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing. I do not care what political complications such a claim might create. I care only that you might choose to build a future beside me, fully seen and fully known, exactly as you deserve to be." Elena's tears finally spilled over, though her smile shone through them with radiant, unguarded joy. "I have spent 10 years believing I could never be truly known by anyone," she said softly, "that survival required permanent invisibility. You have shown me, Cain Ashworth, that such invisibility was never truly necessary, that strength and vulnerability might coexist, that trust, however frightening, remains worth the risk it demands." "Is that your answer then?" Cain asked, hope evident in every line of his handsome face. "Yes," Elena said simply, joyfully. "I choose you, Cain, exactly as fully and openly as you have chosen me." Cain gathered her gently into his arms, pressing a warm, tender kiss to her lips beneath the gathering stars, and Elena allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply exist in the moment, without any calculation of danger or careful performance shadowing her joy. 10 years of hiding had ended, not with further deception, but with the courage to finally step fully into the light, seen and known by the one person who had refused to let her remain invisible any longer. In the weeks that followed, Elena began the slow, careful work of rebuilding the Voss Healing Hall, drawing upon fragments of knowledge she had carried silently in her memory throughout a decade of hiding, supplemented by old records Corwin Blake helped locate within the Northern Territories. Kane stood beside her throughout the rebuilding, dividing his attention between the demands of his growing kingdom and the woman who had become, in the span of a few short, dangerous weeks, the truest partner he had ever known. Their formal mating ceremony took place beneath the same garden fountain where so much of their careful, growing trust had first blossomed, attended by representatives from every allied pack across the Northern and Southern Territories, a public declaration that erased forever the need for Elena to hide behind any mask of pretended weakness. She stood before the assembled crowd, with her chin held high, her eyes clear and unguarded, finally and fully seen exactly as she truly was. Not a frightened, hidden girl, but a woman of extraordinary courage who had survived the very worst the world could offer, and emerged, against every expectation, into a future filled with genuine hope and unshakable love. Draven Cole's fate, meanwhile, was decided by the full council of allied packs, his crimes against multiple bloodlines finally answered through the proper justice he had evaded for over a decade, his stolen power stripped away entirely, and returned to those he had wronged throughout his ruthless rise. The Northern Territories, freed from his cruel rule, began their own slow process of healing under new, more honorable leadership, a small but meaningful ripple of justice, extending outward from the courage Elena had finally found the strength to claim. Years later, when their own children asked about the scars that occasionally shadowed their mother's memories, Elena would tell them gently of a decade spent hiding behind careful blindness, of a king clever enough to see through every practiced deception, and of the courage it had ultimately taken to step fully into the light after so many years of fearful shadow. She would tell them that survival sometimes demanded hiding, but that true living demanded, eventually, the bravery to be fully seen. And every time she told that story, Kane would take her hand exactly as he had beneath that first garden fountain so many years before, a quiet reminder that whatever darkness had once threatened to consume her, love and courage together had proven strong enough to guide her fully home into the light.